Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Sustaining Belonging seminar, webinars on cultivating inclusive residential colleges. My name is Alan Linton. I am the Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at the Associated Colleges of the Midwest, and we're really excited to bring you another great conversation to try to blend the ideas of theory and research with some practical applications to support our campuses. Some couple housekeeping notes. Our sessions are recorded, and they will be made available on our website. You can learn about future sustaining belonging workshops as well as those that have come before at acm.edu under our staff supports tab and under virtual professional development workshops. If you have any questions along the way, feel free to put them in the chat. You can message me directly if you're having tech issues or questions. If you have general questions, there'll be time for Q&A at the end, but please populate them in the chat. Without further ado, super excited and honored to introduce our speaker for this webinar, Ashley Stone, Dr. Ashley Stone, Clinical Assistant Professor and Program Director of the Masters of Education program in the Higher Ed Education School at Southern Methodist University. We've had a chance to talk in a separate setting. Ashley's phenomenal and incredibly insightful, and will be leading our conversation today, thinking about ways to support our rural students at residential liberal arts colleges. Ashley, take it over.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. First of all, I just want to thank ACM for the opportunity to be here today. I always get really excited when anyone will let me talk about rural students and when people are interested in and invested in their success on their campuses. And so I'm going to try to contain myself today because I want to give both an overview to help you better understand rural students, but also be able to engage in a conversation with you about some of the ways in which we can better serve those students. So I'm going to attempt to share the right screen. You know, technology is always okay. And then, oh, hang on, we got to do that second. Let me share screen. Share. Okay. Now, are y'all seeing just a title slide?
Not yet.
Oh no. Here, oh, let me see. Did that make you see a title slide?
You're still in gallery view, so.
That's odd. Let's see if we can, no, we don't want to do that. You know, we were trying. Okay, well, let me see if I can share.
There we go. Now we're there.
Now it's just okay, fantastic. Okay, I've never, you know, technology is definitely not the piece that I am always most adept at. That, and maybe that's a part of my rural background. We'll chat a little bit about that in a minute. As I said before, hello everyone. I'm just really excited about this opportunity. I'm going today to talk a little bit about, like I said, the history or understanding of rural students. I think understanding a little bit about rural communities can help us better understand what shapes the experiences of our rural students. That is what research has shown, is that these characteristics of rural communities influences the way that students experience college. So even sometimes if we talked about the challenges that they face, they may sound like the same challenges as their urban and suburban counterparts, but the root of them is a little different, which means that trying to address them might be a little bit different. I grew up in the rural community of Winnsboro, Texas, also known as Autumn Trails Country, a moniker that is emblazoned on the side of the water tower and speaks to events that we have through the month of October to celebrate the changing leaves. We will pretend like the leaves still change in October since we need to get on to other things today. But that is where it started. And you can see here a picture of that water tower. As I thought about this imagery of the water tower, though, I think about the different ways that rurality is portrayed in media. And I think about this sort of constant image of the water tower. And we will see if it will let us. Oh man, that transition was supposed to be a lot smoother. We'll see these images from from Sweet Home Alabama, from that 70s and later that 90s show, and then from the they were not supposed to play that fast. Then there's also the water tower from the song John Deere Green, where Billy Bob wrote that he loved Charlene on the water tower in their hometown. So we often see these images. And then in just this past year, Akilah Hughes produced a wonderful podcast about trying to change the mascot in her hometown. And one of the things she looks to is the minor league baseball team in Florence, Kentucky, and how they became the Florence Y'alls because of their water tower. And for me, this really brought about this idea of the ways in which the water tower in the community, particularly in a rural space, can stand out as a beacon of what that community is. It is often how I know I'm close to home. As you can see in this picture of the water tower from my own community, it towers above, literally towers above everything else in the space. Aside from a few church steeples, there is no building that is taller than 2 stories. And so the water tower can be seen pretty far and wide, but also tells you a little bit about what our community is about. Now then, well, in the media, this water tower is often a sign of these rural areas. We also see in rural depictions of rurality things as if they are backwards, impoverished, low educated, and predominantly white. Many of these are myths that I seek to disrupt in my own research, combating the erasure of people of color from rural communities and predominantly in rural communities of color that have played important roles in resistance throughout history. And so I think that it's important that we disrupt the ideas and notions of what rurality is often depicted as. As I mentioned earlier, I came from the rural community of Winsboro, but then I went off to college, and I was one of only a handful of people in my graduating class to move on to school or to college. And by the time I returned for my 10-year anniversary or my 10-year reunion, I realized that there were very few people who had actually completed even a certificate beyond our time together in high school. This was about the same time I was planning to return to pursue my PhD. And that's where I really decided that my heart was in understanding the experiences of rural students a bit better. And then when I actually went on to look into that and begin my research, what I found was there was a pretty solid body of literature around the experiences of rural K-12 schools, but almost nothing on the experiences of rural students who went into higher education. I'm really grateful to note that since that time, we have seen a big expansion in scholars who are focusing on rural students college students from rural communities. However, I will show you the names of some of those at the end of this today. So while there's still a lot of work to do, it's been exciting to see the uptick in this work over the past decade. So I always like to start my work by talking a little bit about defining rurality and why that can be a challenge. So first of all, when people ask, well, what do you mean by rural? Well, There are a lot of definitions. If you look at the federal level, I believe across the many different agencies, if they are still standing, there are about 24 different definitions of what it means to be rural. And when you go to the state or local level, it can continue to expand. That means that across each of these areas, some people might be considered rural under one definition, but not another. Also, most of these definitions are pretty problematic. Many of them are urban centric, which means they focus on actually defining what is urban and then saying everything else is rural without paying attention to what that might mean. The second piece is most definitions are often focused on population density, which really means that rural student or rural communities are rarely defined on their own terms or thought about in terms of what are the characteristics that make a community rural. There is an author, though, that writes a little bit about characteristics of rural communities. Atkin writes about 6 different characteristics of rural communities. Now, it is important to note that Atkin writes from a UK perspective, but many of his works have come across, and when we look at the research, it seems applicable here in the US as well. These different characteristics are a small scale. They are isolated, a product of agriculture or environmental activity, strong community feeling or more tightly knit, conservative and traditional values, and a slower, less pressurized way of life. You can see that he was British by the spelling there in that last piece. When I do my own research around rural students, one of the things that I like to do is to make sure that they have an opportunity to self-identify rather than just placing that definition on them. And then I have the students talk to me about what does rurality mean to them. As I do that, I have found 4 of these 6 pieces really commonly reflected in the ways that rural students talk about their home environments. And those 4 are the small scale, being isolated, having a strong community feeling, and the conservative or traditional values. It's not surprising that these being the main characteristics that rural students use to identify the rural spaces that they're coming from means that they also are the ones that seem to most influence the ways in which rural students are experiencing their college or university life. So that being said, these are the 4 things that we're going to focus on today. So the first thing I want to talk about is this idea of being small scale and isolated. These 2 things are often discussed in tandem by rural students. And often the way they talk about it is that there's only one of something. So this means that size was never about, hey, I think that when I asked them, what do you mean by it's small? They never said, oh, I think that a rural community is 1,000 people or less. I think a rural community is 15,000 or less. But what they would talk about is, well, my town is small. You know, we only have one grocery store. We only have one gas station. We only have one stoplight. We only have one high school. Now, they often had many, many churches, but I was doing this study in the South, and I will talk a little bit about the influence of those many churches a little bit later on. But they kept coming back to this idea that there was only one of something, and particularly if they only had one high school in their community, they often thought of that as a rural space. So one of the things I like to do when I'm talking about this work is discuss both the benefits and the strengths that come from these, as well as the challenges that students face. I think that's really important for us to consistently disrupt some of the deficit narratives that rural students face. So as we go through these, I'll talk about some of the strengths that these characteristics bring for students, but also some of the challenges that they can face. And then we'll look at ideas for how you can address some of those challenges. So in terms of strengths, one of the big things is they understand how to be prepared for something. If they have a school project that they are working on, they cannot wait till 10 o'clock at night to go and get the supplies that they need for that project. Often, again, there is only one grocery store. It is primarily a grocery store, often not something like a Walmart where there would be a variety of supplies. And it probably closes by 8 or 9 o'clock in the evening. And so students have to be thinking ahead and be prepared to know what they need to get a job done. When they're not prepared, it leads to them needing to be very resourceful. Again, the closest where I grew up, the closest Walmart was 30 minutes away. The closest Target would have been probably an hour away. That would have also been the closest mall. So if we didn't have access to something that we needed, we had to figure out how to make do with what we had in our house. And that's what a lot of students talked about. They said, you know what, I always have to be thinking ahead to know what I need and be prepared, but I also know how to make do with the things that I have access to right here. And that was something that a lot of my rural students in the thing said that they didn't necessarily see that same type of mentality in the urban and suburban like roommates or classmates that they would often work with. While it brings these strengths, there are also challenges that rural students face. And one of those things can be navigating the new scale of people and places that they're engaging with on their new campus. Now, then, for those who are transitioning to a large research institution, this can be particularly overwhelming. I had one student whose university was literally 100 times the size of the population of her community. That meant that one of her introductory courses was the same size as the total population of her rural community. Now, this is one place where many of the colleges within ACM can really be a great place for rural students to transition to, because it does have that smaller space to transition into that may feel a bit less overwhelming in terms of the number of people that students are encountering and working with and trying to learn and get to know, as well as the physical space of the campus being a bit easier to navigate. Now then, if you are located in an urban area, a couple of other things that students from rural communities talked about being a challenge is, one, often they had been driving for a very long time. They had been put on a tractor, and this, even me living on an acre, I could drive a tractor around fifth grade. They had been driving for a long time, but they're often driving on smaller 2-lane highways. Transitioning into an urban area with the level of traffic, multi-lane highways, traffic circles, some of these other things was really overwhelming for the students. So even though they had this skill, putting it into sort of this new and expansive space was really challenging. The other piece is that in their hometowns, they rarely had public transportation. When you can kind of get from one place to the other that easily, there's not a big use for public transportation in many rural communities. So sometimes they were pretty nervous about figuring out, what does the bus schedule or train schedule look like in this new urban area that I'm in? However, learning to navigate public transportation also took the pressure off of having to figure out or take on driving in that urban environment all of the time. So that's a little additional piece around navigating this new scale of people and places. The second piece can be limited academic opportunities in their community. This is not for lack of wanting to offer academic opportunities, but just logistical capacity. There are often a limited number of things like AP or IB courses because you have to have a demand of enough students in the community that are seeking those classes to provide a wide variety of them, as well as faculty members who are able to teach them. This this means that that can limit the subject areas that they are involved in. I often tell a story of my own sister. She is now a PA in a rural community, but she knew going into physician assistancy that chemistry too was going to be a really important class for her. But we didn't offer chemistry 2 AP in our hometown. Nobody had really needed or asked for that class before. And so she is a determined young lady, but she had to go into the counselor's office and say, I would like to have this class. And they said, we're very sorry, but we cannot have our chemistry teacher give up a whole class period to do an independent study with you on this. We need at least 10 other students who will commit to taking this class. I will just say my sister's a very persuasive person and did ultimately talk 10 people into taking chemistry 2 with her. But that was the level of initiative it took to get that class because of the limited resources available. You can imagine with that type of limited resource in terms of the number of faculty who can teach, that also means there are some limitations around the labs, science labs and things that are also found in the schools, and the types of things that students can gain regular exposure to in those communities. So often when rural students are making a transition into higher education, it's not necessarily about challenges maybe with their intellectual ability in being successful, but a lack of exposure and opportunity that they've had prior to entering into that. So I have some ideas here for a few different ways that you might be able to help with some of the supporting rural students in their physical and academic transitions into schools. This could look like pathway programs. This is something that a colleague of mine that I've been working with is focusing on in West Texas, particularly around increasing medical student or medical profession pathways for rural students. And so bringing in rural students in the summers to local colleges and universities that are teaming together to give them exposure to different career pathways, but also the types of technology and things, exposure to the types of classrooms and laboratories that they would be working with. If you can find opportunities to connect with local rural communities and give students opportunities to become accustomed to being in some of those spaces, that could be helpful. This could also be done rather than reaching out and doing it throughout the schools, through like starting, in middle school or high school with students, could be using summer bridge programs to offer students, again, these opportunities to get more comfortable in maybe the science labs or have exposure to additional curricular content prior to entering in their fall semester. Some other things, if you're in an urban area, in orientation programs, thinking about having programs that access public transportation together so that students aren't trying to navigate that on their own and by themselves the first time around, and thinking about how academic supports can focus on talking to students about how they may not have had opportunities to do this in the past, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the ability to do these things now. These are just a few of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of this physical and academic transition. I am talking way more than I normally would in a class, and I also cannot see the chat from here. And so I want to pause here for a second just to see, are there other identities based on some of the strengths and challenges that I talked about in that first slide around this idea of students coming from a small and isolated space into the college campus, where you think maybe some of your colleges could really facilitate their transition, or ideas of ways or programs that you have that might be particularly helpful for rural students. So I'll take a moment to pause here and see if other people would like to shout out some of their ideas in this space.
And I'm monitoring the chat here. If folks want to put things in the chat, I can read them aloud, or if folks want to come off mute, feel free.
Ashley, I just want to say that I love that story about your sister advocating for the chemistry class, because it also demonstrates resourcefulness to an nth degree. So thank you for that great anecdote.
Absolutely. Well, and so one of the other things I talked about, the limited academic opportunities in terms of like AP or IB classes, but a lot of times people also think about dual enrollment courses, or the ways in which local community colleges and online education could be an opportunity for rural students. But that assumes that there is the infrastructure available to them to take online courses. And so I have examples. Both of my sisters still live in rural communities, but they are definitely sort of in an upper middle class situation, and they don't have the like actual and it took them my middle sister, the one who is very resourceful, years to actually get the internet in their home. It was a matter of infrastructure, being able to actually provide internet in their house. And my youngest sister, it didn't take her quite as long, but has had in 2 different homes that she lived in these rural communities, had to wait for there to be enough demand to then be able to provide the internet to her home. So one of the students in my a student in one of my studies talked about how the only reason she was able to access distance, like an online course from their community college, which again, we think about community colleges, but for me, our closest one was 45 minutes away. For this student, the closest community college was a full hour away from her. And the only reason she was able to take it was because her mom was the school librarian. So she was able to stay in the library until she finished her work in the afternoons, because she did have dial-up internet at her home. That was the only internet they had access to. And it wasn't strong enough to support her engagement in the online class. And so we also have to make sure we have sort of that infrastructure support for students to be able to access that. That meant some students who didn't have that kind of access were limited to distance learning courses that were actually taught through their high school. And so it was just the subjects that were able to do that they had access to. So that was another way in which the students sort of had to figure out, again, there's not transportation to those schools. So you have to have a vehicle or a friend who's willing to take the class too, who can take you. So there's some other hurdles that sort of combine this idea of the lack of opportunity, but also some resourcefulness on their part to try to make it happen.
There have been a couple of comments in the chat that I just want to call out and elevate as well. Claudia, who I see is also now in video, so I don't know, I don't want to speak for you, but you mentioned appreciating the strengths focus as something to celebrate, and access. And then also mentioned rural students could be well-rounded in other ways, participating in sports as a reference point. I had a friend that was saying that she had to join everything to help her friends have what they wanted. I want to call it, just kind of elevate Carrie's comment that culture shock is real, very real for rural students, and to be mindful of that. Something that Ashley, you talked about, it can be shared in different spaces, the culture shock of transitioning, but how it shows up can differ. And then Jennifer put in a couple of comments, travel. Rural students have lacked opportunity or value of extended trips because of perhaps agricultural commitments that prevent travel. Who's going to take care of the farm? Who's going to take care of animals? And the hype of, and quote, farm to table, close quote, in dining halls is not as much of a novelty for rural students. It's the only way they've been raised. And I think all of these comments start to put together the idea of thinking through or having a pause to think about what are distinct factors and for whom are they distinct, and what are the factors that are in fact quite normal, the status quo, and how may those things be received depending on the background and positionality of the students.
Absolutely. So we'll move on to the next characteristic now. Thank you so much for that input. So tightly knit, the communities are tightly knit, and often this came with the students saying, everybody knows everybody. And so that means that there is often an overlap in people's lives within rural communities, making them very interconnected. So I talked earlier about how this idea of it being small and isolated means that there's only one of things. That means that you are in classes all day, often with many of the same students, with the same people. You are running into those same people at the grocery store. You are on the same sports teams. And as you mentioned, usually in these rural communities, you would have students who are playing almost every sport available to them. You need people who are willing to play that many sports because you need to be able to field that many teams. So it was not uncommon in my town. So we were Winsboro. We had a W on the letter jacket, and that we'd have someone with a sport in every little point of that W, or an activity that they had lettered in every point of that W, because that was how you could fill a one-act play production, the band. We didn't have a choir because we didn't have enough capacity to have both band and choir in our area. And so we needed to fill all of the sports teams. And again, most of these students are playing on with the same group of people in those sports from the time they are in Little League. They play on teams in multiple sports, but they're also in scouts with the same group of people. They may attend church or temple with the same group of people. And so there is a lot of overlap in their lives. This also often means that their teachers and their principals are not just their teacher and their principal. You know, their math teacher is the aunt of their best friend and was the coach of that Little League team that they were a part of. Their principal is the mother of the best friend, and they've spent their entire life spending the night at their house, and also led their scout troop growing up. So people serve multiple roles in the lives of students often when they're coming from these rural communities. So you can't get away with much, but also people are constantly going to be checking in on you. They know about you more than just that 45-minute or hour and a half long moment they see you in the day every day. They know about the fullness of your life. And so they are constantly in a space and opportunity to provide support to you. This also means that rural students, I found, at least those who are successful when they go to college, are really used to accessing available resources in their community because they're a part of what everybody's doing. They go to the library again because they're friends with the librarian. They've known their librarian is their own aunt or their own mother in the story that I shared earlier. So they really understand the resources that can be available, even though they're limited, and they take advantage of those. But they also really understand the value of that community that they grew up with, and they care for that. And it's something that they want to often recreate when they get to campus. They want to find community when they come to campus, and they understand why that's valuable and how using those resources can be really helpful. So those are some of the strengths that happen. However, there are also some challenges. And part of that is learning to adjust to building new relationships. Within these rural communities, not only is there often a lot of overlap that exists in their lives that sort of naturally builds those relationships, but often people are living in these rural communities from the time they are born all the way up. They're not moving around a lot. Many of them, their families may have lived in that community for generations. And so they have been in the classes, like I said before, they're in classes with the same people all day, but they have often been in classes with those people from the time they were in preschool. I would say that the vast majority, probably 90% of the people I went to preschool with were with me when I walked across the stage for graduation. graduation in my hometown. And many of those people, their parents graduated with my parents, and so on. Some of them, even their grandparents, graduated with my grandparents. And so I've known them my entire life. That also means that I hadn't made a lot of new friends until I went to college. Most of the people in my life have been really integrated in my life for years and years and years. And so maybe there was one new person who had come in and we would try to bring them in and help them feel welcome. But me trying to go out and make a new group of friends was something I hadn't experienced before. A lot of rural students talked to me about this in our interviews, and they said they felt like their urban and suburban counterparts had had a lot of practice because when they were in school, each of their classes might have been with a different group of people, and they played summer ball with a different group of people than they played ball at school with. And then they attended their religious services with a different group of people. And so they felt that they were more savvy at navigating lots of different types of spaces in their life all at once. I often sometimes said they weren't very good at small talk. When you've known someone your entire life, you don't think about how did you get to know that person. And so sometimes students said, I kind of felt like I wanted to start really deep with friends right away, and they needed a little more time to adjust. But I was used to having these really strong, close friendships in my life, and hadn't really thought about what does it look like to start at the beginning part of those friendships. That also speaks to this idea of just not adjusting to the lack of overlap and having to try to create that on their own. So these are some of the strengths and challenges that can be faced coming from such a tightly knit community. Now then, a few different ideas that I would put forward around supporting students in their social transitions. One, living and learning communities, I think, can be really helpful for rural students. They do create some of that natural overlap that they're used to experiencing within their hometown. So it can offer some opportunity to have at least a couple of classes together and a residential space together that starts to recreate some of that overlap that they might be used to. And those ways are opportunities and avenues for creating creating new relationships. Here I put small talk skill building. I think sometimes we think about, and depending on where you fall on the student affairs spectrum or faculty or staff spectrum, you may have very different feelings about icebreakers. Here, I'm not just talking about maybe some of the silly, goofy icebreakers that can make people, that some people love and are really fun, and some people dread and are terrified of, but opportunities. It can be easy as like, if you're having a starting banquet, having some prompting questions that are on the table that people can use instead of having to come up with them on their own. It doesn't mean they're having to go around and put an adjective with their name, but that they have some questions that can really generate conversation and maybe help them build some of those skills there. And then the other thing is, unfortunately, we can't always just send people into new living learning communities throughout their life. So through that, also helping them to think about how do they create the type of overlap and connection that they want with people beyond just one class, just their student work position, just that, and helping them to think about what it looks like to be more proactive about creating that additional time and space with other people when it's not just automatically built into their position. I'll pause here again and just see if there are some ideas maybe from the group about types of programs or structures on your own campus that might facilitate some of this social transition for students.
I'll jump in. I think Jennifer Vestal, she, her, from Denison University. And I think empowering students that are rural that on their leadership skills. Certainly there's a lot of leadership development in the college environment, particularly on the student affairs side of the house. And often because there's been such a small cohort of your graduating class of 70 or 90, maybe those were the leaders in their high school or in their communities. And so finding ways to help those rural students connect with leadership opportunities and leadership development at the college is a great way if there's not a living and learning community.
Absolutely. And as I said before, what just in the same way that you most of the students are needing to play multiple sports or be involved in multiple activities, you're also going to see them. They may have been the president of the Spanish club and the lead of one act play and the president of student council all at the same time. Because of those multiple involvements, they're also often used to managing lots of different commitments all at once. So things that could really prepare them for being strong leaders that they may not have thought about in that way. Oftentimes when they're encountering, again, their urban or suburban counterparts, they're seeing people who maybe were really successful in a really niche area. But they don't necessarily see other people who have maybe the breadth of experience that they were able to tap into that can make them really versatile. So that's a great idea. So again, it can be a challenge, I know, for all college students who are transitioning. Sometimes you are in a place where you maybe have a strong pathway from maybe an urban school into your community, and so they come in waves. But in general, everybody's probably trying to make new friends when they get there. So it's just important to understand that for rural students, they may have some of these other skills that they're trying to quickly learn alongside in terms of that, building those opportunities for themselves.
I'll just call out that Carrie in the chat added that those leaders in high school could also be challenged with humility, right? Being in a space where they were the leader and then coming to, at least for our types of schools, a bigger space with others, with more leaders in a new environment. And so that could be a possible area where there's a challenge to transition.
Absolutely. One of the other things that happens a lot in rural spaces is there's a book called Hollowing Out the Middle, and it's from Carr and Kafalis, that they talk about the ways in which often rural communities are pouring all of their resources into the top performing students who then go on to college and often don't return to the community. But I think exactly that means that those who are high achieving are often serving in all of these areas and may not have faced the same type of competition to rise to that space as some of their urban and suburban counterparts. And to not just be able to walk in and be sort of the top achiever in every area can be a lot. A big fish in a small pond getting dumped into a big pond can be quite an adjustment. We talked earlier about what that looked like physically and academically, but definitely socially as well. And particularly if their identity was really connected to that role they played in their rural community of being sort of that leader and that person who was always sort of successful across all of those spaces, that identity shift can also be really challenging for them. So I know we don't have a ton of time left, so I'm going to go ahead to our last area, and this is conservative. So it talks about conservative and traditional values. I think a lot of times nowadays people assume that that means Republican, particularly with rural areas in the US, but this actually isn't what most of the students meant. One of the things that I did when I would interview students is I would also look at like the political returns for their communities to see if they were sort of left or right leaning, because they often talked about them as conservative. And many of the communities, particularly in my work in Texas, with rural students coming from border communities, they actually leaned quite Democratic, but they would still be, in terms of voting, but the students described their communities as really conservative. So I often pushed them and said, like, what do you mean by that? And so this is where I think particularly some of this idea that we talked about earlier around culture shock can also come in, aside from sort of that some of those big shifts in terms of scale and size. And so this idea of conservative, students often discuss rurality as being conservative, but when pressed, what they meant was these sort of restrictive ideas around gender and sexuality most often is where they faced this, and that it was really more connected to a large church going culture in their hometowns rather than a political leaning of their towns. Now, again, I do want to put in the caveat, I was in a southern state when I was doing a lot of this work. A lot of the other people that I know who are doing work on rural students most are in the rural southeast. There are definitely some pieces that people are doing some other spaces, but primarily in the rural southeast. And so in those spaces, the church communities were a part of this sort of restrictive ideas around gender and sexuality. What I found is that these are the ideas that they grew up around, but particularly for the students that I was speaking with, they didn't quite feel like those ideas were a good fit for them. They weren't exactly sure where to go to or have access to sort of what they were looking for, but they didn't feel quite comfortable. So most of the students in my research were actively seeking out a school that identified as more liberal so that they could explore different ideas and values. So a lot of times I know we hear narratives about how our higher education is radicalizing our liberal students. I know most of us just want them to read the signs that we post and the syllabus we hand them, but so rather than thinking about it in terms of the influence of these institutions of higher education, the students were actively seeking this out. And it was something that they didn't just accept the new ideas that were placed in front of them, but they really critically thought about, what does this mean? Is this something that I can believe in? Because it felt so new, they really wanted to understand it before they sort of decided whether or not they wanted to integrate it into their own life. The challenge is that students are often then concerned about how this will impact their relationships with people back home. They're concerned that this will cause a separation from a community that, again, we talked about before, is really tightly knit. That tightly knit nature of those rural communities can mean that there feels like a greater pressure to conform to the space. And so these conservative ideas that students felt like this is where I need to fit in because I love this community, I'm such a part of this community, and this is what the community believes. So it can feel really risky to start to explore new ideas and values, but most of these students were actively seeking to do that, but then also trying to think through, what does that mean in terms of how this can impact the relationships that I have with people I care deeply about back in my home community. So a few things that I look at to think about how we might help students if they're making some of these ideological transitions. I think focusing on tools for critical reflection, not just here are the new ideas you want to expose students to, but making sure that they feel equipped to think through what those new ideas are and what it means to integrate them into their life in a more thoughtful way. Provide opportunities to practice difficult conversations. Honestly, a lot of the students that I spoke with, there were some seniors who had sort of moved past this and started having conversations with people of their hometowns. But a lot of the concerns they had were anticipated concerns about how people would respond to their new ideas, rather than having actually engaged in conversations, talked about their new ideas with people from back home, and experienced any kind of pushback. And so providing practice and opportunities and spaces to think about how to have those conversations with people back home so that they feel like they can go back, be their authentic self in that home community, and continue to pursue things at their college. And then also making sure we're creating support systems on campus. As they're growing and changing and experiencing these things, if that does create any kind of rift with their community or their family, making sure there are support systems that exist there on campus that they can be leaning on as they try to work through that with those people that have previously been their support system. One additional caveat that I'll put on this idea of creating support systems on campus. I know most campuses have robust counseling, or we hope to have robust counseling and do have some counseling supports on our campuses. One of the things that many of the students that were in my study actually talked about accessing counseling services for the first time once they were on campus. For many of them in their hometowns, there were not counseling services available to them, at least not beyond the guidance counselor in their school. And so they didn't have an opportunity to be able to see a therapist in their hometown, just because there often wasn't one available. And two, there were concerns about, again, we've talked about how everybody is connected and how tightly woven it is, how uncomfortable they might feel. Oh, everybody's going to know I need therapy. Oh, this person already knows me in all these other ways. I don't know how I feel comfortable talking about these things with them. And so for many of them, for a number of different reasons, being on a college campus was the first time that they really felt like they had the opportunity to access therapy and counseling opportunities. And that was something that they really valued. And so one recommendation I had that I haven't been able to see play out, but think could be helpful, is potentially having sort of a small group therapy option for rural students where they could see each other, or even just like get together through the counseling services that sort of helps them manage some of these transitions, but also see that there are other people going through similar experiences on campus as well. So this is a little bit, again, this is not, I hate to essentialize rural communities. There's a lot of diversity that exists across them and within them, but these are some of the characteristics that often come up. And again, the ways in which not only my research, but the broader research, I've recently done a sort of meta-analysis of research that looked at how these characteristics across the growing body of literature, how that reflects these main characteristics. And the ways in which knowing the roots of some of these challenges may mean that we can take some of the programs and resources that we already have and think about how to introduce them to rural students a bit differently. So that is sort of what I have here. I definitely want to open it up to see if there are other thoughts that you have or resources on your campus that you think might be helpful in terms of this ideological transition. And while we think about that, I'm going to put up this one last slide. This is just a reference. I referenced Atkin. And so that's the main reference that you'll see up there. Also, there is a book that recently came out, Race and Rurality, Considerations for Advancing Higher Education and Equity. This was a book that was actually edited by Sonia Ardoin, Darius Means, and Tyler Hallmark, which you'll also see on there. And these are just a few people who have been doing research for a little while, in addition to myself, in the higher education space. It is definitely not exhaustive, but there may be some of the names that pop up most often currently around some of these pieces. So some people that you might want to look into more if this is an area that you're interested in. But again, would love to wrap up with just any additional ideas that you have around these ideological transitions, or any questions or additional thoughts that you have today.
I'll jump back in again, Jennifer Vestal from Denison. I always think about how we position our offices and what are those symbols in our office that kind of might be communication or conversation starters. I'm wondering if you have like the picture of that water tower in your office as a way to kind of jumpstart conversation. One of the things I have, which I'll be really dorky and show, is I was a long time 4-H'er, and I grew up on a farm. And this is my trophy from the last year I was in 4-H, which my dad mounted on bookends. And that trophy has been, which is a bookend or bookends, have been in every office that I've ever had. And it is like, sometimes people are like, is that a cow or a sheep? But it is a way to kind of generate a conversation and really kind of pay homage to the humble roots that you come from and to help build a connection with a student.
Absolutely. There are definitely a few little things that I have around, but primarily, I won't lie, it doesn't take me long to bring up where I'm from when I'm chatting with someone. But also, I think that one of the things that I often see is that they can often be symbols to me and other people. That you saying that makes me think about the ways in which I can spot an FFA. I was not in FFA, but I had so many friends. I can spot that blue corduroy jacket from miles away, and I'm like, oh, hi, like the people I know, or you can relate to the people that I relate to. And I've found that there's a lot. One of the other things that we can't talk about here, there are also some other work around. There's a book called Out in the Country. That looks at queer experiences in rural spaces. So there's more and more that's looking at some of these things. And honestly, it's sometimes carrying around the book or talking to and just being open about where I'm from and listening. And as students, asking them, so where are you from? And sometimes if they say like, oh, I'm from near Tyler, which probably doesn't mean a lot to anybody here, but like, I'm like, oh, what near? Okay, but what do you really mean by that? And really encouraging them, like as I ask people who they're from, is not to just say near Dallas, but no, like what is the town you're really from, and affirming that it's somewhere. I have a dear friend, Kathleen, who studies rural students as well, and she talks about us being from the middle of somewhere instead of the middle of nowhere, and really trying to affirm, like when I'm talking to people, well, I don't always have those physical things, when I'm asking them where they're from, really kind of pushing to say, no, 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 not just like generally the area. Tell me about that town. It's valuable. I may know where it is. And if I don't, I'm really curious to learn more about it. What is the festival that your town has? Because most of them always have a festival of some sort. Or, what is the sport that was a big deal in your hometown? Ours was women's basketball, which not a lot of people think about in Texas, but that's what we were known for. And so, like, taking some of that time and helping them feel like they're from somewhere that's valuable, and they should say, even though they know, like, as soon as I say I'm from Winsboro, people are gonna go like, where is that? And I'm gonna be like, around a whole bunch of other stuff you haven't heard of. But I can start there and say, like, I'm from this town, this is where I'm from, here's how you would get to it, but then start to talk about like what's valuable about that. And so for me, trying to start by pushing and saying like, no, I want to hear about this, it's important to know, again, especially since often they've been tied to that space for so long.
I want to get in one last question before we go. We at the top of the hour, and it comes from Betsy. In your research, did you find any rural students who are looking forward to college as a time to take a break from the everyone knows me or I have to be involved in everything kind of lifestyle?
Absolutely. They didn't necessarily talk about it as much in terms of like, I don't want to have to be involved in everything anymore. But there was definitely a sense of, I'm ready for something, like that ideological piece of I'm ready to like learn something new. They were ready to have new experiences. My dissertation started with a quote from The Wizard of Oz that talks about, it's Dorothy meets Miss Professor Marvel or whatever, and is talking about how she wants to leave this town and go see big cities, big mountains, and all of these things. And that's often what a lot of these college students are doing, is trying to go and have a new adventure, see something beyond this town that has sort of contained them forever. And while it might be still special and meaningful to them, and granted, some of them are like, nah, no looking back, I don't, I'm ready to go. But for even those who really felt closely connected, they wanted to go see more of the world. They wanted opportunities. They wanted to chase careers that were meaningful and fulfilling, but that they didn't necessarily see an opportunity to have in their hometown. A lot of the other people who have gone on to college don't return because there aren't opportunities to return to in that community. And that's what they're looking for. And so there is sort of this excitement and desire to do that. But then that also means building a whole lot of skills to be successful at it as well, and find all kinds of characters along the way to support you in your journey. We pull from there and The Wiz as we move through it and talk about how it didn't need to move to Harlem to become an authentically Black story in The Wizard of Oz, that it could remain rural and still be authentic in that way, to disrupt some of that diversity narrative that I talked about earlier, but was a fun way to think about how we move through life and go to seek these bigger things, but also may stay really connected to those places and people that influenced and shaped who we are before we left.
Just absolutely incredible. And I'll say, as a final word, using some maybe moderator privilege, I think one of the biggest takeaways here are thinking about the entire student, the full student experience, not from a deficiency standpoint, but what are the things that both academically but socially, on campus, back at home, what are the fullness of the student experience? How can we support that? And thinking that liberal arts colleges are really great places to lean onto the skills and think critically and differently about that. And so thank you so much for your expertise, your time. It's an absolute pleasure. And thank all of you for being a part of this session and contributing and checking us out. For more information, you can always visit acm.edu under our professional development series for more about these workshops, the Sustaining Belonging series, as well as other sessions. Our next one's going to be in mid-February, looking at how we can support our disabled students in higher education, featuring Ryan Miller. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
He's great.
And
You should come to that.
you should come to that. And we look forward to you being a part of a future session. Take care.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.